What is fantasy football?
Fantasy football is a game that you play using the performance of professional athletes, professional football players. What you do is at the start of the season, you draft a football team. There's usually about 15 or 16 slots on your team. You draft a quarterback, some running backs, wide receivers, and then you put up a team against your opponent who also drafts their own team. You put up a team each week against your opponent in a league that has either 8 or 10 or 12 or 14 teams, whatever you decide with your group of players. And the performance, the real life performance of the football players in their respective games generates points, and you get those points based on the players that you have on your team. At the end of the weekend, at the end of all of the games on the weekend, you'll have a certain score, and your opponent will have a certain score, and the highest score wins. As a football fan, I like watching football anyway, but what fantasy football does is it really gives you a stake in what's happening in the game. As a casual fan, I'm interested in certain teams and I like to watch certain teams play, and I have teams that I root for, but as a fantasy football player, now I have specific players that I really root for. I may have a player on a team that I don't particularly like, so it makes it a little bit difficult to like a player that's on my team but hate the team that he's playing for because they're one of my, lifetime foes as a football fan. But that's fantasy football in a nutshell.
What is the difference between a PPR league and a standard league?
In fantasy football, there's two different ways to generate your score. All of the scores for all fantasy football leagues are generated by the performance of the actual real player on the field in whatever game he's playing. When you generate points in a standard league, you only generate a point for every, let's say for a running back, for example, you only generate a point for every 10 yards that player rushes or 10 yards that he gets on a reception, on a passing reception. The difference is that in a standard league, say he got 20 yards or say he got 25 yards, you would get 2 points and 2 points only for that player's performance. In a PPR league, PPR stands for points per reception. So let's say that same running back rushed for 11 yards, but he had a reception for 14 yards to generate the 25 yards I was talking about before. He will get the 2 points because every 10 yards he gets a point. But since he got a passing reception, he gets an extra point for that. And in some PPR leagues, they are very finite about his yardage. So if he got 25 yards, he would get 2 points for the 20 yards, half a point for the extra 5 yards, and then a point for the reception. So he would actually get 3.5 points in a PPR league for the same performance that he only got 2 points for in a standard league. What it does is it really makes the game more complex. It makes it a much more finite measurement of the player's performance. And usually higher level fantasy football players all play in PPR leagues.
How is fantasy football competitive?
There's a lot of ways that fantasy football is competitive. One way is doing the preseason research to make sure that you draft a good football team, a good group of players to play against other players. There's a lot of strategies that go into that. Some people go for running backs first. Some people go for wide receivers first. Some people will go out and pick a top-level quarterback. There's a lot of different strategies that people follow. There's a lot of things that you also have to research, like bye weeks. In fantasy football, or in regular football, teams have a bye week. Well, if your fantasy player is on that team, he's also going to have a bye week from your fantasy league, and he's not going to generate any points for you. So if you don't look ahead and you draft a bunch of players who all have the same bye week, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you don't have players to play. So that's some of the preseason preparation you need to do. During the season, you need to do preparation as far as doing research on the health of your players, making sure none of your players have gotten hurt and they're being taken off of the team or they're being put onto injured reserve. Each week after the games are played, you have an option to go to something called the waiver wire, which is basically a reserve of players who are not on anybody's fantasy football team, and you can drop one of the players from your team and pick somebody from the waiver wire. That can be a really useful tool for fantasy football, and there are a lot of people who use that tool week after week after week to keep boosting their chances of winning. Another way that fantasy football is competitive is just having access to good, reliable news sources so that you can find out news about your individual players on your fantasy team. You can find out news about the team that your fantasy player is on. You can find out news about the team that your fantasy player is going to play against. There's so many different directions that you can go with this, that in order to be competitive in fantasy football, you need to be doing research and you need to do it on a daily basis.